All right. Welcome, everyone, to the I Am Policing Roundtable. I am tremendously excited about our conversation today with our special guests from the policing world. Um, my name is Josh Leonard, and I am the Director of Operations and Development at the Institute of Applied Metatheory, which for those of you who are not familiar, I am is a sort of part think tank, part network for connecting people who are using big picture philosophical and theoretical approaches to get some comprehensive handholds on the many and complicated challenges that we face as a society. We've got a lot of interesting things going on right now, so I encourage you to check out our website to get some updates on what we've been up to. But today we are here pulling together some experts in the integral policing field to talk a little bit about where they see the greatest opportunities for taking a more integral approach to policing and addressing some of the needed change and evolution that is possible in that world. And so I'm going to let each of our guests introduce themselves. Maybe, Chris, why don't you start us off?
Thanks, Josh. My name is Chris Ori. I'm a retired police lieutenant from the city of Hayward, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I retired at the end of 2015, thinking I was going to go on a seeker's journey, a more spiritual journey of exploring other parts of life. And in grad school, I found integral theory, and it made me take a hard left turn right back to policing because I think that there is so much that integral has to offer to policing. So since then, I have gotten my master's degree. While my degree was in comparative religion and philosophy, my master's thesis was about applying integral theory to policing. So it was how we could transform U.S. policing via the AQUIL framework, which is part of integral theory. And the goal really is to make policing more of a flourishing environment for police officers and for the communities they serve. It's not a one-way street, and integral theory just brings a lot to the table in that regard.
Excellent. Thank
Oh,
you,
one more
Chris.
thing, actually.
Yeah, please.
I'm in my PhD program in integral noetic sciences, and I will actually be applying some research in my PhD program and dissertation to this area. Haven't figured out what that looks like yet, but hoping this discussion and discussions like it help me narrow that down a little.
Great. Hopefully, we can come up with some interesting ideas that might lead to potential research projects. That'd be great.
Yeah.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks for your leadership in this space. Gestur, why don't you go next?
Oh, thank you, Josh. Yeah, so my name is Gestur Pálmason. I am a former police officer in Iceland, which currently ranks, I think, number one as the safest countries in the world. We, however, know everything that you guys know over there, just on a smaller scale. I spent 15 years in law enforcement, did everything from special operations to organized crime to cross-border stuff and border stuff, and ran a few projects for Europol, the European police, in collaboration with the Icelandic police. So have had the great opportunity of doing, I think, almost all of the jobs that are available here in law enforcement. I currently work as a leadership developer using the integral theory and AQUIL frameworks as applied to business, the world of business. And same as Chris, I just saw, once I got to know it, and still see an enormous opportunity for transformation and understanding of law enforcement generally through using these frameworks. So I was really excited because you know how this world is. I thought I was walking around the world with my own thoughts. Didn't even have a clue that there was a bunch of really smart people out there thinking about similar things. So I'm really happy to be here and honored to be invited to the conversation.
Yeah, we're happy to have you. I'm glad you found us, and I'm really looking forward to hearing some of your insights from a different perspective than those of us in the United States. Ryan, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Josh. My name's Ryan Johansson. I currently serve as the chief of police for the city of San Bruno, which is also in the San Francisco Bay Area of California, not too far from where Chris did most of her time in policing. I've got about 20 years as a policing professional at this point, and my integral connection here, I guess, would be that I'd been studying on one level or another the integral sort of perspective for many, many years before becoming the chief of police, and always saw what I thought was a really powerful nexus there between some of the reforms and changes that were continually over time being demanded from the policing profession and taking a more integral perspective in terms of how we make sense of the world we operate in policing. And but I was really felt like I was on an island there. I tried to kind of introduce it to some of my contemporaries over time, and generally, as can happen in a policing environment, was just kind of laughed out of the room as this is all theory and crazy, and just go back to our dictatorial sort of world of policing. And so at one point, I actually reached out to the folks at Integral Life and had kind of asked for some help, just understanding the concepts on a deeper level than I was capable of, and seeing, does anyone else agree that there's applicability here for policing? And immediately they reached back out. I connected with Rob, and then Rob connected me with Chris, and then Gastur came into this group. And like all of a sudden I realized, as he said, I'm not alone. And there are other people here who are in fact much smarter than me and further along in some of this research that I've been able to benefit from. I think what makes me a little bit unique in this group is that I'm still in a practicing environment. And so some of these theories I've had the luxury, especially given my particular situation and my rank, to just implement and see what they do and actually kind of test them in an environment where there's not a tremendous amount of risk to see what impact they have. And I, in fact, just completed my master's work at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey. And my thesis is technically on police culture and recharacterizing it as organizational culture. But there is a very clear integral applied metatheory slant in there to include the use of the four quadrants as a decision-making model for police executives. And so that's kind of, I guess, why I'm sitting here.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, what an esteemed panel we have. I'm excited to dive in. Let's start our conversation by just talking a little bit about the sort of current context of policing from your point of view. And again, Chris and Gastur, I know you guys are not currently in the policing world, but it sounds like you've kept enough sort of connected to it to be able to answer from that perspective. But I'd love to hear specifically your perception of where, if at all, the energy is around police reform or the evolution of sort of the policing field. There was obviously a lot of attention being paid to the larger field in the wake of George Floyd's murder in 2020. Some of that has receded, although there have been lots of, I'm sure, downstream effects from those kind of earthquakes that happened now 4 years ago. So I'd love to hear what sort of challenges and opportunities are there in the idea of police reform, police evolution in the current sort of time frame and context that we're in now today. Ryan, maybe you can speak a little bit from your insider perspective first.
I can certainly try. And of course, I mean, this is going to be dependent to where you are in the world and even where you are in a given state as to how the effects of what happened with George Floyd are felt still today. And I'm glad you set that context, right? Because at some point, someone may be watching this many, many years from now, and what I'm about to say may not make a whole lot of sense. But the context we're in is that we just came through yet another. It's important to note this was not the first sort of reform era in policing where there was just a tremendous amount of focus on the demands for change and how police operate. But we're now actually in a window of time that I would characterize as very, very different. In fact, as a current police executive, my greatest sort of fear at this stage is that we're experiencing the typical pendulum swing. And it's very, very important to have integral leaders in positions of power and influence within police departments who are not so opportunistic as to take full advantage of that pendulum swing, right? And to be clear about that, I think the pendulum swung immediately following George Floyd very much to the side of like, we almost don't even care if police can go out there and do their jobs and stop crime and do the things they have to do. We just want them to stop hurting people. So much so that there were talks of defunding and eliminating police altogether in some communities, right? And we're done with that. I think very, very clearly in almost anywhere in the world, we are done with that. But now we've also seen significant increases in crime, significant increases in things like the opioid crisis is crushing many communities, the increases in theft. And so the communities are now instead back over here saying, wait, we want the police to get out there and do something. And it's very tempting as a police executive to sort of capitalize on that and say, yeah, let's go back to the way things were. Let's just, really go back to what it takes to effectively police a community and control crime. And we have to be better than that. We have to say, hey, the pendulum needs to come back a bit. This was not a great idea, but we can't let it go back here again, or the inevitable outcome is going to be coming back to the other extreme again. So I think that overall, at a high level, that's where we find ourselves. We find ourselves in a position where most communities are fed up with where we have found ourselves from a crime and victimization standpoint. They're turning to police departments to solve that problem, but police departments cannot use the mechanisms and methods they used pre-George Floyd to accomplish that objective. And so they're confused and not really sure what to do. And so with that, I'll stop and allow someone else to opine.
I'm wondering, Ryan, if there's some residual, because one thing I've noticed is I've mentored a lot of people into the field, even since retirement, and I've seen a lot of reticence of people going into the police field. And it seems like even though the pendulum is swinging back in the other direction in regards to crime and addressing these issues in the community, we are left with a lot of reticence around people not wanting to join this profession. Are you seeing that as well?
Yeah, I think that if I'm accurately paying attention to the current moment, I think that's starting to dissipate as well. We're seeing the recruitment retention crisis not being quite so severe in a lot of places. We're starting to see more applicants for the job again. But yes, I still think it's not even back to where it was pre-George Floyd, right? I mean, the recruitment retention crisis in the US is very, very real. Most departments are operating at 40 to 60% of what their authorized strength is. So there is a definite reluctance to come into the line of work. I'd be curious to hear what the people you're mentoring are saying about why, because I get a different perspective when I only talk to people when they're really pretty highly interested in a process. But typically what I get from them is it's mostly a fear of how they'll be seen and thought of by people whose opinions they care about because of this sort of overarching view of law enforcement being quite negative still.
That's exactly it. Yeah. I've even talked to people who have switched directions from policing to firefighting and other areas that are just, people want to belong. People want to be loved if they're going to be in service and dedicate their life to something. And it's a challenge for police officers right now. Our communities are not always doing a good job of that, of appreciating the police officers that are risking their lives to take care of us.
Esther, what are your observations of sort of how that pendulum has or hasn't swung from your context in Iceland?
Well, I think we recognized, although we haven't had a case to the magnitude of George Floyd here, and it's very rare that Icelandic police, and I believe actually that the Icelandic police has killed one individual in its history. So it's quite rare that this happens on our side. However, in terms of the issues that you're raising, they're all the same. So if you look at the police's ability to deliver its service at a standard of quality and in time that the citizens expect, it's not happening. And it's rarely happening in the Western world, which affects people's sense of justice, that, whatever happens, if my house is burglared or I get assaulted, if I even get an outcome from the judicial system, it's going to take years and years. And so people are not experiencing what is justice through engaging with the mechanisms that we have, because they're all suffering under either too many cases, not enough people, not enough investment, whatever it is. So I think that's a very familiar tone across most of the departments I know in the world. I think on the second piece, in terms of the recruitment and retention, I think that's an interesting one, because I think culturally, I think there's a lot of work to do culturally in law enforcement in general. And I think culturally, we sometimes are our own worst enemies when it comes to how we talk about the job and the experiences we have. And we don't necessarily always understand that that affects people who might be interested in joining. So rarely do we come together and talk about it in the way that it's the most amazing experience and this and that and the other. And I think what the integral and ARCL model brings is a thing that I certainly missed in my career, which was the understanding of how your own personal values and internal landscape changes over time on the job and what that means, and how the culture receives or rejects your individual change through that time period. And so because we lack understanding of how that works, I think we get ourselves into problems internally, which then of course affects the service that we give the citizens. So I would say, familiarity with the issues and optimism about how we can use some of these models to get better.
Josh, I think since obviously the spirit here is to be thinking as integrally as we can, I would hate to move on from this question and not be clear that, in my opinion, from my position, all of this is true, and yet it's always tempting to focus on the negative. The reality is that as painful as it was to be in a position of policing leadership in the United States through the post-George Floyd sort of aftermath, it produced a lot of things that are positive, in my view, for this profession. And that will not be wildly popular among the active law enforcement audience to hear a chief say, but I'll give a concrete example. And that's been the increased focus on officer wellness and resiliency from a much more integral perspective. Suddenly, audiences that really just didn't seem to care about that at all. I mean, it just fell on deaf ears for years, the discussion about the suicide rate among police officers and that, unhealthy hurting people hurt people, and that might be part of the problem behind police misconduct. It just all fell on deaf ears, and it does not now. We still have a long, long way to go. But that platform would maybe have never been created or not created as soon without the friction point of what happened with George Floyd. So I think there have been some significantly positive outcomes, not the least of which is holding police to a higher standard is a good thing. How we respond to that is obviously very subjective, but nonetheless, I think that there have been some positive outcomes from this tragedy.
Brian, I'd be curious in that sort of pendulum swinging, right, which in the integral world is an idea that we think about a lot, mostly in relation to polarities, and we sort of see these polarities in all kinds of places, in all kinds of dimensions. I'd be curious how aware in your experience is there, not necessarily certainly the dynamics of a polarity, but this sense that this pendulum is shifting? Do you think everyone has a sense that it's shifting back and is aware of where it's shifting back to? Like, I'm curious what your perception of that is.
Wow, that's a terrific question. I think, at least within my small little corner, I think police are very aware that the pendulum is swinging. And unfortunately, again, like maybe are eager to be quite opportunistic with that. It's very tempting to use fear to get more resources, more cops, more funding in your budgets, and you're seeing some of that. And it's not that the fear is completely misplaced. There's been significant increases in crimes and things we should be deeply concerned about as a society. But if we're too quick, which again in policing we tend to be, to kind of say, "I told you so." Yeah, I knew that all this change was wrong. Now let's go back over here. Let's really get aggressive with how we police our communities. Let's go super arrest focused, prosecution focused, put people in prison, and then we're going to fix the problem. That's ignoring the fact that that's what we were doing before, and there was still a problem, right? So I do think there's a high level of awareness among the police. I think at least in my community, there's similarly a high level of awareness that this pendulum is swinging, and some concern over how to slow that momentum and what does equilibrium even look like? Where is the balance point?
Yeah, it seems that it's actually, if you're minimally aware of the dynamics of, organizational development, cultural development, individual development, you can see that, what turns a polarity into that you're swinging back and forth on, potentially not aware of what the drawbacks or benefits are of each side, that you can just watch over time pendulums swing back and forth between kind of counter reaction and then counter reaction and counter reaction, and that really what something like integral metatheory brings to the table is this idea of a dialectic, the idea that you're not just swinging back and forth between two poles, but you're trying to integrate those poles in sort of a higher level synthesis that takes the best of what each of those poles brings. It seems like there's a real unique opportunity there, but only if key decision makers are aware of that, even as a potential. Any sense from any of your conversations that there's some awareness of that potential? I mean, obviously someone like Ryan is going to see it right away, but is there any opening that you see that there is a potential for something different than just going back to the standard policing model?
I mean, from my perspective, absolutely. It's one of the benefits I'm seeing of we have a new generation that is the core of our workforce, and there's a lot of police leadership that is complaining about that. It's always difficult when you get a generation gap in a profession. You try to figure out how to talk to a whole new group of people with a new worldview. But my experience has been that the new generation is demanding something in the middle of those two poles, whether it pertains to their desire for greater work-life balance or the fact that, like we talked about earlier, they want to be seen in a positive light with people who maybe don't think of police as very positive. So they're not willing to let that pendulum swing all the way back over here. And if you're a department that wants to do that, you're not going to keep people for long. I could make a very good argument that that's part of the reason some departments are experiencing serious recruitment crises that, granted, I'm a smaller department, but I am not experiencing. We've been continuously fully staffed for over 4 years. I think largely because we are appealing to that new generation with more of a middle ground.
That's exciting.
Yeah, it's very heartening. It's very heartening to hear, because that's exactly what we need in any field is to be able to hold that tension between the polarities that exist throughout our career, throughout the world, which is something that Integral does for us. And I think that there are some people that do it naturally and see it. And it's really heartwarming to hear that the newer generation of cops are kind of just intuitively, coming to that. And there's still a lot of leaders out there that maybe need to be more explicitly shown what that can look like.
Yes, sir. Any thoughts from your view on the sort of awareness of that pendulum shifting? And again, it may not be shifting exactly the same way in Iceland as it would be in the States, but I'm curious if you're aware of any of that awareness.
I think I wouldn't say explicitly. I mean, we too are getting the newer generations in, and it is shifting the same things. That Ryan talked about, work life. The longing for work-life balance, the longing to be seen as doing something important, and all of those things. It's seen in a positive light. I think some of the more rudimentary ways of looking at it, even if you park the pendulum swing for a bit, if I look at the Icelandic police through the 4 quadrants for the last years, for me, the most of the focus of the evolution has been in the it. So, the body cams, the tasers, the better cars, the dash cams, like all of the stuff, that is intended to meet the reduction of officers in the street. We've been unable to fill the shelves of new officers for various reasons, and lesser so focus on both the cultural aspects, which has resulted in quite a high churn, and then the internal growth, which I think is an absolute key to moving forward in law enforcement. That of course we tend to all the quadrants, but I think we're lagging behind, at least in the Icelandic police, in the I and the we. And I think even if we would put similar effort into the I and the we as we've put into the technical solutions, that would give us a totally different landscape in a very short period of time. So I think from that perspective, it's interesting just applying the model and looking at the police force through that model. But the pendulum is swinging less, but I could see it if something were to happen in the way that it happened in the US with George Floyd's murder, that we would have a similar pendulum swing. I don't think that police culture, at least in the Western world, differs that much from Europe to US to Iceland or wherever else in that sense.
Yeah,
It's
absolutely.
very interesting.
It's one of the arguments I made in my thesis that police reform efforts have had a very right-hand quadrant approach. You know, we've been dealing with the behavior of a particular police officer, and then we respond in the it quadrant, as you said, with a systems-based approach of discipline or firing or new policies or training at the expense of the left-hand quadrants, where we do pay attention to the interior of the police officer or the interior of the culture, you know, as far as the collective. And I think that's, if I had to say one reason why Ryan and his department are so far ahead of the curve on this stuff, is because he does pay attention to the left-hand quadrants. He's paying attention to the values, the stresses, the wellness of the police officer, and how that impacts culture within the department and how they impact each other.
This is so critically important, this concept that you've both brought up in terms of looking at policing through the 4-quadrant lens. It becomes so immediately apparent that even in legislation, not just internally in police departments, we try to solve all problems basically with policy, which is fully right quadrant focused, arguably bottom, lower right quadrant focused only, completely ignores the individuality of our reality, and just says, look, just tell them to do something different and create stronger and stronger consequences if they don't do those things. And yet here we are. I don't want to say that reform overall in policing has been a failure, because we are light years from where we were in the United States 40 or 50 years ago, in a much, much better place. And that's a whole separate conversation. But nonetheless, it is viewed as largely that most reforms have failed over time. And when you look at individual departments and their big reform efforts, it's true that they have failed over time. And why have we not considered the possibility that's because of where we're focused? The adage that culture eats policy for breakfast, lunch, and dinner is very, very, very obvious in policing. And yet we're so reluctant to focus on the drivers of culture, and instead want to believe that we can just tell people to do something differently and create a bigger stick for when they don't, and then things are going to fix themselves. That policing is a deeply human endeavor, arguably one of the most human endeavors you could possibly undertake. It involves incredibly intimate interactions between human beings in extremely volatile circumstances on a minute-by-minute basis, and yet we're really not treating it that way if we're not looking at it with all 4 quadrants.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, because the result, from my perspective, of that evolution of policy, and usually policy tightening to try and get a different result, has also resulted in a lack of creativity in approaching law enforcement and policing. And I think in a world that's getting increasingly more complex by the minute, the creativity of the law enforcement officer and the quality of his or her thinking is paramount. And if we try to right ourselves from responsibility, which is often the case with policies and rules and checklists, we also disable people from thinking outside the box or addressing new solutions. And that's, if I see a pendulum swing, that's probably there where, for the longest time where I've been involved in law enforcement, there's a pendulum swing between, if there's a new type of criminality or something that happens, do you educate the officers that are already out there to, add something to their arsenal to understand that issue? Or do you create a new department to address that specific issue and make it, the issue of that department? And what you then often get is throwing the issue across the fence. So you get the polarity between centralization and then distribution of knowledge and capability. And I think that's a pendulum swing that we also have to address in terms of getting the best of both worlds, rather than kind of continually swinging back and forth and getting no decent results. I have to say on a positive note that in terms of the I quadrant, the Icelandic police picked up a heart rate variability program from Canada. So in the training, we're now using heart rate variability quite a lot to help people manage their internal state as we put them through the ringer in different situations. And as far as I know, this has proven to be a very positive step. So, but it's focused, with some measurement on the internal space. And of course, I think law enforcement is predominantly a mind game, and if you have to resort to physical activity, most often something has gone terribly wrong. And so and that is the way that we would want our officers certainly to interact with the citizens, is that you start with your brain, you assess, you think, you find solutions within the confines that you have, and you take it step by step. So I think there is so much to unpack here in terms of just using the 4-quadrant lens, but I also think there's a lot of good things happening as well.
That's really interesting innovation. I hadn't actually heard of that as something that was being tried, and it makes a lot of sense. It's essentially a way of forcing officers to pay attention to their internal state by giving them some sort of biofeedback of what kind of a stress state or arousal state they're in a moment, gives them an opportunity to reflect on their mental state, and hopefully I'm assuming the idea is that it gives them an opportunity to make a better decision based on whatever state report they're getting back from these kinds of devices. Is that the idea?
Yeah, well, the idea is that there is a very clear connection between heart rate variability and brain function, and of course brain function and quality of thinking. And so what we're trying to do is help people avoid the fight-flight response as much as possible, and understand that connection, and understand that if you can maintain a coherent heart rate variability, the quality of your thinking increases, and you will be able to make better decisions. And a very kind of concrete example of that is that we run exercises, of course, as everywhere, where you send them to an apartment and you give them a story of what's been going on. And either the story is benign, there's party noise, or there's somebody heard a gunshot. And of course, the different stories, give people different physiological responses. And then you show them that they run into a situation they thought were relatively benign, but completely missed the gun on the shelf or the knife on the table or whatever it was, because the level of tension was so high they were unable to maintain situational awareness. So once you understand that connection, you start to really focus on because it's down to officer safety, really, the level of quality you can maintain in a stressful situation. So this gives us objective measurements to help them understand that connection, which I think is phenomenal.
We've used this as well. It's kind of interesting. We originally used it because there was some pretty compelling data on the percentage of police serious misconduct incidents that follow other incidents of particular types. So, when an officer has an experience that sort of puts them up in that orange or red zone, something very traumatic or something where someone's, really attacking them, yelling at them, saying things that get them fired up, that misconduct will often follow in a completely unrelated incident where they have a disproportionate response to a level of threat that they're presented with. And so we started using HRV as a means of giving them the biofeedback to figure out when have you brought yourself back to a baseline that now makes it acceptable to respond to the next call. And we probably, took it a little bit too far with looking at it that way, because we talk about sort of the power structures that make things difficult. Well, one of the problems with biofeedback in policing, at least in the United States, in our heavy litigious society, is that this becomes another marker that outside entities can look at when they want to explain police misconduct or how an officer was not in the appropriate state of mind to be doing something they were doing. And so we were running into as they're training on how to regulate, how to use different meditative techniques or breathing techniques to come back down, they may run into times where they can't get to a baseline and another call comes out, and now they need to go to that call. And how do we surmount that challenge within that space? We have to find a way, because in our testing, this HRV regulation was insanely powerful. We ran a whole bunch of tactical training exercises where people regulated HRV before going into a critical incident or tactical environment, and people did not. And we measure their level of composure, their ability to respond instead of react. And it's profound data. I mean, it really is a game changer. If you can regulate your HRV, you're so much more likely to respond instead of react to what happens. But we have to find some sort of a way to use that in an environment where it doesn't end up getting used against us.
Well, I think
You mean literally in terms of liability in certain circumstances, it could be used as you should have known that you should have responded to the scenario because you were in this particular state. That's the idea.
Yeah, similar to the argument about physical fitness, right? It's like there's a certain fitness level that an officer should maintain, period, in order to respond to what they have to do. But the minute you want to start testing for physical fitness levels, or you want to start doing mandated psychological testing post hiring of officers, you could have unintended consequences, not the least of which is liability. And similar with the HRV and other biomarker monitoring.
It brings up another polarity I've been thinking a lot about, and that's between the individual police officer and the collective, the individual and the collective, meaning the community, because that's such a great example of how the community is going to turn something against the police officers, against police departments trying to do the right thing and elevating training, elevating our understanding of how the body works. And what we haven't done a good job, I think, is educating the community about how difficult it is to be a police officer, how police officers are human and cannot be perfect just by design. I studied, with these metatheories, we're starting to go into other areas. And Edgar Morin, who created complex thought, he talks about the fact that we have ignored the limits of humanity, the limitations of any individual police officer. And I could get into the whole argument around qualified immunity, which is pretty touchy, but the bottom line is we're expecting humans to be robots, and humans will never be robots. And I don't think we've done a good job of educating the community around these things. And every once in a while, when we bring in a community member to do like a firearms scenario test or something like that, it really opens their eyes to, wow, this is really challenging. And when I did my command college thesis, I had some community leaders do the implicit bias test and actually had people that were very supportive of the Black community and even Black leaders showing bias against Black people in this implicit bias test. Now that was 10 years ago, and things have probably changed since then, but it's just an example of that was very eye-opening to those people. And we just have to do a better job of that, of not expecting our police officers to be perfect, because we're not. They're never going to be. We're human.
So we've talked a little bit about, in terms of sort of setting the context for what I hope in this sort of latter portion of the conversation, we can start to narrow in on where some of those potential transformational opportunities are in the policing world. But before we get to that, I want to sort of see if there are other current pressures or drives that are creating opportunities for change, transformation, reform. Some of the ones I've heard thus far are there is pressure from the outside in many of these communities for police departments to respond more aggressively to the crime that's been ticking up in their neighborhoods in the last few years, so that there's some outside in pressure for some actual tactical advancement in the ability of these police departments to actually manage the crime and address it. So there's a pressure there, for better, for worse. The other pressures, it sounds like we're hearing from the sort of inside out, is that there's a pressure, especially as younger generations are coming in. There's more of an idea of trauma awareness. Green sensibilities begin to come into police departments. Just this idea of of trauma awareness, of mental health, of stress reduction. Some of these biofeedback tools are certainly creating some opportunities for people to become a little bit more aware of their states and to manage their states in a more conscious way. So those are a couple examples of the sort of outside in and inside out pressures for change that you are aware of in from your viewpoint. Are there any others that you feel like are worth noting as we start to think about, what are the places where we could have the most leverage?
For me, I think we're remiss if we don't immediately identify what, at least in my position, is one of the strongest pressures, which is legislators and legislation. And that's never going to go away. I think the issue is that in this post George Floyd era, even more integrally informed executives in the policing profession are not getting a seat at the table, at least in a state like California, when there are real serious conversations about new laws, major changes in the way that we either that police operate or that the other aspects of the criminal justice system operate. And it creates a tremendous amount of pressure because at the end of the day, your average citizen's expectation is that the police is the forward-facing, visible entity they expect to address these issues. But our abilities to do so are very significantly impacted, both positively and negatively, by lawmakers and the legislation that they dive into and pass.
Is that a change? Is that something that is just a result of the fact that there's more legislation being passed now, or was there a point at which you felt like there was more of a dialogue between police on the ground and the policymakers who were deciding what they were legally liable for, or what their policies that might constrain them in certain ways?
100%. From a pretty informed place, I've seen a dramatic shift there. And unfortunately, I don't have some of the key data points directly in front of me, but in the 18 some odd months following George Floyd's murder, there were some 2,000 acts of legislation passed in the United States that were fixated on police reform. You never see anything remotely close to that. Here in California, I sit in the executive committee for the California Police Chiefs Association, and as part of that role, I serve on the Law and Legislation Committee. And for years, we would meet to talk about legislation that we thought we needed to have our eyes on and we needed to talk to our electeds about. And we would meet once a year before the legislative session to have that conversation. It would usually be maybe 15 to 20 bills that we knew we really needed to pay attention to. To give you a better idea, this year it was 2,200 just in California alone. So yes, the whether it's opportunistic based on the environment or because it's driven by legitimate need is probably somewhere in the middle, but a huge, huge change in that environment. And where an organization like the California Police Chiefs Association used to carry a lot of weight there, that they would seek our endorsement for these bills and listen to our feedback and amend language. We're only just now getting back to where they really cared all about what we have to say. There was a significant window where we were vilified so heavily that we're not given a seat at the table.
Wow, and the challenge there, it would seem to me, is that there was enough will to get over the hump to make all these significant police legislation, for better or for worse, during this period, and then once that will for change dies down, those laws persist, even if there's some level of agreement that some of these things need to be rolled back or reconsidered. It's difficult again to generate the sufficient political will to amend a lot of that legislation. So you're going to see, I would imagine, downstream effects of that kind of legislation for years.
Especially because a lot of that legislation, it passes the sniff test on such a profound level that it's almost impossible to walk back from. Like your average, voter that hears about concepts like decriminalizing drugs thinks, we all think someone who's addicted to drugs shouldn't be in prison. And yet it's a far more convoluted, multifaceted issue than that. And one very key component, only one component, but one key component is that policing perspective to say, here's what we think. You're calling them unintended consequences, but we saw them coming. And if you had just consulted with us, we could have at least made you aware of them and the decisions that are being made.
Yeah. Wow. That's profound.
I think I'd like to give not just one really good example of that Chris and I talked about recently. So, when when in California, when possession of most narcotics was a felony, almost none of them were charged as felonies for simple possession. They end up in diversion programs and in drug courts. And so I had a conversation with my district attorney in my county just a few months ago. And he had said that during that period of time, on any given day, there were about 300 people in our county in court mandated drug rehabilitation programs. Mostly people getting access to services to help beat their addiction they're otherwise not going to get because it's compelled by hanging a felony conviction over their head. Post Prop 47, which is a legislation in California that decriminalized almost all of those possession charges, brought them all down to misdemeanors. On any given day, there are now 3. So this is a real significant unintended consequence where people who need access to services that are funded by our tax dollars are not getting those services anymore because of legislation that makes sense and feels good. There's no way you're ever walking back that legislation and making it a felony again to possess drugs. And probably you shouldn't. But we have to find some sort of a way to continue getting those 297 people the help they need, or we're going to be where we are now, right? We're 4 or 5 years into that legislation, and we're at a catastrophic drug problem in the state of California.
Yep.
When I was listening to you talk about all the legislation, Ryan, I was thinking about all of the policies that our officers are dealing with. It's almost like the macrocosm of the microcosm. My former agency had 900 pages of policies and procedures, which goes back to Gester's point about they're just very stifled with all these procedures, if they can even remember them all. So what you're dealing with, at a higher level, they're dealing with at a lower level. And, I don't know exactly what the answer is, but it seems as if we can start addressing these interior issues more so that those things become just as important as the exterior elements, that maybe we can make some headway.
Well said.
Well, I think there's an interesting, there was a conversation based on some things that were happening here locally about, police and police reform, police brutality, and all of those things that as well. And I was in one of those forums, and it was interesting just to run the statistics on it, because I live in a country that has 400,000 inhabitants, 2 million tourists a year, around 600 police officers nationally, so it's not big. These 600 police officers have about somewhere between 60 or 70,000 interactions with the citizens every year. Of those, there are 20 to 30,000 prosecuted crimes. Of those 50 to 60,000 interactions, you have about 20 complaints made against officers. About 2 of them get sent to the district attorney, and potentially 1 gets punished by the court of law. So statistically, and I would imagine that the statistics in the US are not far off from this. So when you look at the totality of law enforcement citizen interaction, and then the negative outcomes of those interactions, I am pretty confident they are absolutely minimal. Yet, because of the noise of some of the more public ones, we pass laws, like Ryan pointed out, that affect a lot of people and potentially reduce the ability to interact with a citizen in a positive way, for a very little cost, for something that could have been fixed in a different way if we would have looked at it through the 4-quadrant model. Like, what went wrong? Was it the policy that went wrong? Was it the officer's state that went wrong? Was it something in the interaction that went wrong? And address it accordingly. So we keep going to the wrong quadrant for solutions when the actual issue is in a different quadrant.
Yeah, I think, the 4 quadrants obviously lends itself so well to these kinds of scenarios, to be able to get a quick glance at what are the different causal factors in any one scenario that you're trying to either improve or make some sort of reformation around. I think the other piece is the one that really jumps out at me is just the systems thinking that you're talking about, Ryan. It's the idea that there's going to be downstream consequences, and that in order to be able to understand what those consequences might be, you have to be able to think second order, third order, fourth order consequences and understand them from each of these different, sort of quadratic perspectives. So, it's always surprising to me how much any of these sort of spaces that an organization like IM is trying to get to understand better really comes down to dealing with tremendous amounts of complexity, dealing with sort of the ramping up of ideology on almost every front, right? And then the sort of systemic effects that ripple out from each of those, that these are all systems problems. And in order to really understand a system, you need some new distinctions. You need some new ways of making sense of the system that help unpack it, so you can find the really key kind of leverage points. So we've talked quite a bit about some of the outside in pressures. So now we've got legal pressures. We've got citizen pressures who want a reduction in crime almost at any cost. We've got the internal pressures of inability, or some challenges in recruitment. We've got pressures to take a more trauma and mental health informed approach. What else have we talked about? We've talked about, the pendulum swinging back, and a certain awareness that if we let the pendulum swing all the way back to sort of traditional policing practices, that we're not going to be able to have the kind of evolution of the police force that we would like to see. So given all those different pressures and sort of context setting, what are some of the areas I'd love to hear from each of you around what areas hold for you a real potential to make some sort of leverage change? Not necessarily, as I've described in a few different contexts. I think there's sort of two ways to use a big picture viewpoint like integral meta theory. One is to see the big picture, to see the whole system, and to try and take a multi-pronged approach at the same time, right? To address whatever that system is in its full complexity, in its fullness, and address multiple aspects of the system at the same time. Certainly a very valid and powerful use of big picture meta theory. The other one, though, is one, honestly, that Rob, I think, has helped me to see a lot more clearly, is this idea that you use the big picture to figure out where the points are where you can make a small shift that has a big difference. And that in a lot of ways, that's a much more efficient way to use these big picture theories than trying to tackle the whole system in its entirety, is to figure out where are the leverage points. So I'm hoping to, with the rest of our conversation, dive into where you all might see some potential areas for leverage point being. They don't necessarily need to be tested. We don't, I think what might come out of a conversation like this is some things that we might want to explore further with an integral policing initiative, maybe do some research around, maybe do some piloting around, see who is doing this work and doing it well that might show some results. But I'd love to hear at least what some of your informed intuition is around what some of those leverage points might be.
Well, I have a few ideas. I recently attended the Integral Conference of North America in Denver and had the opportunity to talk to a lot of different people. And one of those attendees who works for government in Australia, and I spent about 4 hours talking about integral policing after the conference. And we really talked about a top-down and a bottom-up approach. And what I see is the top-down, at least within policing, and certainly this has to be broadened to the community in some way at some point, but to give the police leaders the quadrant view, the bigger picture perspective, so that they can make sense of what's happening, so that they can do what Ryan does every day and put things through the quadrants and consider states and stages and some of these other things that integral theory brings, so that we can broaden that perspective and maybe narrow the pendulum in the process. And then the other is the bottom up. I would like to see some educating of police officers in the interior environments around perspective taking, around sense making and meaning making, More concretely, it could be like what Ryan does with his officers after a traumatic event and how to integrate that, and just pay more attention to them as humans and help them focus on their interiors and how they interact with the community in that regard, so that they can learn and grow and develop. And I don't know, it seems like by doing both, maybe there can eventually be this growth and meeting in the middle where, like I said, the pendulum just swings much less and we're able to see things, in a bigger perspective. And I know that still goes back to big picture thinking, but it's teaching police leaders the quadrants and maybe a little bit more of integral theory, and helping police officers and police employees with the upper left quadrant, that interior stuff that we're starting to pay more attention to. It's been an evolving thing, but I think we could do a lot more.
I would love to go into a couple, each of your ideas a little bit. Let's dive in on this one just a little bit, Chris. I'd be curious, and the rest of the panel, I'd love to hear you weigh in on this as well. What pressures, a lot of the way that we are trying to look at things at IAM is this idea of what makes a new idea fertile? What makes a new innovation? What makes it ripe? And what are the conditions that would make that, whatever that intervention might be, in this case, let's say, training senior police leadership on the four quadrants as a way of sort of modeling the different systems that they swim in. What problem does that solve for your average police leader? Obviously, we know the value of taking these sort of big picture approaches, but I'm curious what you think the incentives they would have to take on a new model like this. What are some of the pressures they're under that this could solve a problem for them?
Yeah, I really want to hear from Ryan and Gester on this, but I think immediately the response is just the complexity of the world, the complexity of policing, the complexity of society's problems. Police leaders need and want, I believe, a tool to have a way to respond to that.
Yeah, I think in my view, I think the result of the increased complexity seems to be looking at the world in shorter time frames. So, with the level of citizen pressure and internal pressure in the departments, we just see a lot of short-termism going on. It's just the problem right now, and so I would argue that even with the four quadrants, you're giving people the ability to go, I've actually ran this exercise with police officers where I asked them to tell me, like, where do you, in a typical day or week, where do you place your attention and focus? And they come up with a long shopping list, and it's all what I would call kind of short-term stuff that needs to happen. Get the shifts done, get the cars right, get the equipment stuff, make sure the funding. There's very rarely, if any, sort of strategic long-term thinking where the department is going to be in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, where the society is going, where industry is going, all that stuff. There is sometimes they come up with something in the we space, specifically if there's a cultural issue within the department, and 0% they come up with something. Well, I'm thinking about how I feel about continuing on in the job, or how tense I am, or the level of pressure I'm experiencing having all this on my shoulders. Never ever does that cross their mind. So I think even in that context, the ability to help them see the broader picture and how they themselves fit into it, and the different timescales is helpful. I certainly found, for me, when I was looking back at my career, it helped me immensely to look at it from the perspective of value systems, and specifically the spiral dynamics. And I could literally go through phases in my career where I went from red to blue to orange and then eventually into second tier, by which point the police didn't really understand what I was about and we couldn't function together anymore. So it's a really interesting way to look at. I mean, just to give you a small example, when I started out, and I remember the exact feeling of putting the uniform on for the first time, and I felt the power. I felt the red. Like I can literally go out and tell people what to do, and they'll do it. And I just really felt that. And then, of course, I exercised it and found that people don't necessarily respond very well to it. And so you evolve to wait a second. Oh yeah, no, it's about the rule of law. So suddenly you give your grandma a ticket if she's jaywalking because everybody's equal in the eyes of the law, and you get very, kind of process oriented about it and all of that. And then, of course, you start to look at the criminals and you go, do you know what? These professional guys, they don't play by the rules. They don't have shifts and they don't have anything. So if we're going to get some results here, move to orange, we're going to have to kind of see where we can play on the fringes here to get some results. Now, if you're in a narcotic unit and you have that value system, that's quite dangerous for you because you might start to cut corners and do things outside the books and and we have seen multiple incidents of where that goes wrong. And that if you get past that, you might stop to think and go, do you know what? This is all about my community and how I serve my community, and that's where I need to be, and that's where my thinking is. And then when you make the jump to second tier, you start to understand that the system is so big and so complex, and the interconnectivity between the judicial, the law enforcement, the prison system, the social services, how people are brought up. And after 10 to 15 years serving a community, you start to see the kids of the people that you did calls on are now becoming the new calls. So you start to see the generational transport of the trauma and all of the things that go on. So it gives a very clear lens to how you can look at the individual officer or the culture, how you can identify what the upsides and downsides of that worldview is, and how you can help people migrate between those worldviews. And it was really astounding to me. I saw some research many years back from NYPD where they said, well, the officer is the happiest 2 years after graduation because the world's your oyster, and it's all more or less downhill from there. And for me, that's an evolutionary issue, right? Because we're not helping people understand how you evolve through that job, which is often very demanding. And it's incredibly important that you draw the right lessons from the things that happen to you or you get involved in. And so I think all of these frames offer a brilliant, accessible tool to help us do just that. And I think it might help us with all kinds of downstream issues like attrition and officer mistakes and whatever that is, in my humble view.
I think it's really well said.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, I would agree with all of that. And I think that to your question, Josh, of like, what is, when you bring it down to a more micro view, what is, something relatively simplistic that can be done that within an integrally informed perspective can really drive a change. And again, I just have the benefit of being in a place where I'm a practitioner and can implement some of these things. And I'm in a place where the power, systems in play really don't affect my ability to do that anymore. I have the influence and the political clout in my own city to do the things I want to do. And Chris mentioned one of them, and so did Gastur, which is the focus on the eye of the officers, and remembering that this is a deeply human endeavor involving individuals that come to this endeavor with a variety of their own internal stuff and their own external stuff. It might be, in my opinion, and this is largely what the case study and my thesis focused on, the single most accessible point for us right now to drive integral change in policing. Because we have to acknowledge, much as Chris and I have talked about this, much to our dismay, just statistically speaking, we are not going to have integrally informed police officers on any significant level anytime soon. It's impossible. It's hard enough to fill positions with warm bodies, let alone warm bodies who are integrally informed and are ready to think on this much more, second tier level. So I think the key for us is to make sure that as we promote to levels of significant influence in organizations, we really do have to focus those promotional processes on assessing the degree to which those individuals can think integrally, because they have to be the tip of the spear, at least at the top. And then from there, how can we install practices and day-to-day systems that the line level officer doesn't necessarily need to know how the clock works. He just needs to know what time it is. And in officer wellness and resiliency, to me, has been that contact point. That's something you can get cops to buy into fairly quickly because they see and feel the results on that I level. And then they also see and feel the results on that we level. They start to feel like, wow, as we're better individually, we're better collectively. We feel better. We're better at home. We're valued in this organization for our individuality and what we bring to the table. We're not being asked to change or conform just because we put a uniform on. And when you start to create that shift, now you start to affect culture, and you can see an integral change, even though you're not really telling anyone that what you're doing is getting them to think more integrally. So for us, that has been the key. Now you ask, what might be the benefits? Well, I'll tell you, at least in my research, what I discovered. There are many perplexing problems for police leaders in at least the United States in modern day policing, but 5 of them keep most police chiefs up at night if you look at many pieces of survey data. That is serious police misconduct, recruitment and retention, police legitimacy or lack thereof within their communities, officer resiliency and wellness, because they know that we're losing cops because they are going out on disability retirements, they're going out on psychs, or sadly, they're committing suicide and leaving altogether, and then addressing crime. And those aren't in any specific order, but I looked at those 5 pressing problems for police leadership through the lens of a more integrally informed command staff, so leadership, and a hyper focus on individual officer wellness and resiliency. And we saw dramatic improvement in all 5 of those categories since we installed those programs and made them reality in our police department. Significant changes, like a 70% reduction in instances of police misconduct, a 55% reduction in the use of sick time and workers' comp claims among officers. We have the highest rating of any city employee group in terms of their job satisfaction, their feelings of legitimacy in their employment. Like, all these things seem to be fed by the only real change that I made, at least because I had a wonderful predecessor who already had a great department, is in this area. We just hyper fixated on wellness, and we installed the 4 quadrants as a decision-making model for command staff. We do not make any decision involving humans without shoving it through the 4 quadrants and seeing what comes out the other end. So 2 micro focus points with macro impacts to 5 problems that are affecting policing way beyond my department.
That's really exciting. And it's interesting, I'm probably because you guys have some conversations offline together, but I noticed, Brian, that you addressed essentially both of the sort of interventions that Chris talked about. One at the sort of bottom up level, which is a focus on the individual, interior experience of individual officers, and one at sort of the macro level, which is a simple but effective framework for managing some and seeing through some of the complexity of complex systems at the leadership level. Do you think, I guess what I'm wondering is just how aware at the leadership level do you feel that the leaders are aware that they are dealing with complexity problems? Do they frame it in those terms? Are they aware that this is a matter of sort of like being in and over their heads in regards to the complexity? And so I'm curious how you were able to sell this idea of the 4 quadrants as a way of managing that.
Yeah, my experience has been there's a pretty high level of awareness of how complex our problems in our environments are. It's an interesting anecdote from one of my captains who has bought this philosophy hook, line, and sinker, and is largely why we're successful with it. Like, I can drive very, very little change without the people who actually run the department day to day buying into it. And we were talking just a few weeks ago about why, like, we are sharing this in our little corner of the world on a very robust level. And why is it not catching on? Why do we have a department immediately in our vicinity that is struggling from all 5 of those problems I just described to you and not really wanting to implement what we're saying and now can show evidence works? And his answer was so simple and so profound. He says, because it's hard. It's hard. It is so much easier in policing to take a problem in this side and develop a new policy or rule and say, well, look, I did my job as an administrator. And if instead your chief says, I want you to take that problem and analyze it in each of these 4 quadrants so you can understand all the impacts of any solution we might implement. Even though my captains were so excited about this early on because they were seeing the results, there's a fatigue point where there's still this temptation to go back to the old way because it's hard. It is really hard to analyze something like, think about a simple disciplinary matter, a situation where you do know that an officer needs some form of discipline based on some action they have taken. And it is so easy to just look, what most departments do is they look at past practice. Oh, this guy got involved in an on-duty collision while driving too fast and not using his emergency lights. Did that ever happen before? Yeah, it happened 5 years ago. We gave the guy a day on the beach and sent him to remedial driver training. Great, prescription, solution, that's done, do it again. That is 30 seconds of work and it's off your plate and you can move on to all the other complexities you have to manage. But now if your chief says, no, I want you to analyze that disciplinary action and the problem that stemmed it in the first place through these 4 quadrants and determine what do we really need to do here to be addressing this, is exhausting. Now the end results are so much better and the trust you build in the organization is so much better, but it takes time to see that. And time is a luxury that many policing professionals do not have.
Yeah.
And I think when we get down to it, it's an experiential thing. Once you've experienced the quality of it, there's no turning back. But if it's just getting said at you and you go, oh, I'm too busy, and that is, I think, probably the in terms of organizations in general, the biggest resistance I've come against is I'm just too busy. I don't have time. And of course, if you're too busy and there's no time, your situation will never improve. So you either get better at suffering, or you move towards the pain and you go through. And so again, that's a developmental move. And so I think the focus that, and I think it's brilliant that Ryan's has set out is a brilliant start. And I can already see that I certainly could share some very simple exercises to help people have the experience of what this actually does. And I think, there's a tipping point in all of it. But if you look towards, I don't know, I'm probably, given the US with, its extensive land and forces and all of that and different levels and national and local and all of that, it's difficult to find unified KPIs to what makes a good police force. I am in a slightly better situation in that context, but even if you can, like those numbers that you just said, Ryan, are staggering. I mean, the improvement on all the 5 key points, relatively simple to measure, relatively, complex things, but 5 points. Even putting something out about this, I think would capture the eye of people who want to try and move through the pain.
Yeah, I have to imagine that there must be tremendous pressure, if not on, city government and local government, but on police leadership themselves to show those kinds of positive metrics. I would imagine that, yes, experiencing it for yourself and seeing the tone and quality of the way a particular, police force that's been doing work on trauma and mental health, for example, carry themselves and interact with the community, that's going to be the most powerful way. But I have to imagine that there's some other orange metrics that could be used that might move at least some leadership in some places to say, what's going on here? I'd be interested in diving in on that.
Well, I think law enforcement is a bit interesting in that context, right? Because if you have a force, let's use the example of highway speed measurements, right? Going out with a radar. If you have a hardworking force, speeding will go up in your neighborhood, right? And so you go out with the statistics and everybody go, oh my God, speeding is going terribly up. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is our officers are out there in the community working. So statistics are always a double-edged thing in law enforcement and elsewhere, for that matter. So I think you have to be quite careful as to what you choose and you have, I would argue that you would have to find potentially one metric in each quadrant, so you have a fuller picture of, if things are shifting or not.
Yeah, the data points are always so challenging for policing. Because there's no consistency in how we accumulate data points. Even when you talk about something as simple as crime, if you have a jurisdiction with different reporting practices, to put it kindly, than maybe another, then the statistics look completely different. There's a jurisdiction in the Bay Area that has been sort of touting that the alleged spike in violent crime isn't what experientially the communities are saying. We're feeling it. We know it's happening, but they're citing crime data. Well, what they fail to mention, right, is that they've changed their policy to where they're allowing violent crimes. They're encouraging violent crime victims for which there's not an arrestable suspect on scene to report it online. And so someone calls the police and says, I was just robbed at gunpoint. And they say something like, is the suspect there, or do you know who they are so that we can arrest them? And when they say no, someone with a ski mask, and then they ran away and drove away in a car, I have no idea where they are. They tell them, great, go online and file a report. And then the citizen is so frustrated by that lack of compassion and care and service that they don't file that report. And so now you have a violent class 1 felony occurring in your jurisdiction that's not reported. And so there's so much trouble with data points. They're typically used to really make us look horrible. And the number one, because we're already hit on, which is we're encouraged to be proactive, but when you're proactive, it technically contributes to your crime stats and makes things look worse. So somehow those two need to be separated into different pools.
Yeah, point taken. Point taken. It can be sort of a way of narrative warfare, is using statistics to tell whatever kind of story you're trying to get across. So I can definitely see the challenges in that. I mean, it does make me wonder if that is a potential intervention point, right? As if I wonder if some of the ways that we measure the health, the functioning, the effectiveness of police departments is a potential intervention that could make a big difference here, because introducing the standard itself can help to measure what's important.
Yeah, great point.
I mean, we have an interesting statistic here, which is if the population is generally asked, like, do you trust the police? And trust in the police here is hovering somewhere between 70 and 85% of the citizens go, yeah, I trust the police. So it's also very tempting for law enforcement to go, well, we're heavily trusted, right? But, what they trust is that you show up and that you're not corrupt and you won't take money to shift your perspective and all of those things. But it says nothing about the level of care, compassion, service, the things that Ryan just mentioned. So again, there's a lot of granularity and differentiation that needs to happen to understand how this works. I mean, we identified here an issue that I think is known everywhere, which is like the downstream results of domestic violence. And domestic violence was thought to be a private affair in this country. Now, we managed to run a pilot program where the legislature's view of domestic violence shifted to the point where it's now considered a societal issue. And hence, there is now a police projects that have been implemented on a national scale, where as soon as there's a domestic violent complaint, law enforcement comes. If there are children, social services come immediately. And so there is a more integrated approach to that phenomena. Help is provided both for children, for the victim, and for the perpetrator, because the intention is that everybody comes out of that situation whole, and you disrupt the downstream chain of violence that tends to happen. But of course, that caused an increase in domestic violence cases nationally. But that was just because we were gaining the faith of survivors that then felt happy to report it because they knew they would get the help. So it is a complex issue, but one definitely worth going for, I think, because at the end of the day, we and it's been a big debate here with our foreign minister, who's because we've said, well, we don't even have a military. There is no one to defend this country. We have a contract with the U.S. and we're a founding member of NATO and all of that. And we've always come off as peace-loving people and all of that. And now, of course, with the changing security situation in Europe, our foreign ministers say, well, we're no more peace-loving than the people of the Ukraine or anywhere else. Everybody wants peace and security. You cannot build a life. You cannot have creativity, innovation, the positive operation of market forces unless you have safety first. So it's an incredibly important thing that must not be lost in any transcend and include move of any society, that we have to include ways to be safe and secure, because if we're not, you kill everything else more or less. It's quite a foundational thing. So I think, it's interesting to observe from the outside, what's happening in the U.S. on that front, and how the U.S. thinks about different things. But I think the conversation we're having here needs to be had at a way broader level, and that we have an opportunity here to really scale up something that would be useful to societies in general.
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that point. Like, how do we take a San Bruno Police Department and have that spread? And I keep going back to community policing. In the late 80s, this Professor Herman Goldstein comes up with these ideas and tries them out in Newport News, Virginia. And then another department picks up on it, and then another, and then another. And then, one day the President of the United States hears about it and creates this office, community-oriented policing and problem solving. And now there's grants for departments to implement it. Anytime I think about what Ryan's doing in San Bruno, I think about how do we get that to spread? How do we get San Bruno to become Newport News, Virginia? To have integral policing get more footing and to be a tool that makes lives better for police leaders, better for police officers, better for community members, better in so many ways, just by bringing this simple but complex framework to bear in a complex issue.
Yeah, and there's so many booby traps in that space, right? We talked about, I don't know if it's the right one, but the path I've chosen to try to get that to proliferate has largely been the wellness space, and this idea that if you take better care of cops, they'll take better care of communities. And what I maybe failed to anticipate as much as I should have is that people would not necessarily see it the way that I'm seeing it, and that would mean that it doesn't have the same impact. It quickly has become, in my humble opinion, a checkbox for most police chiefs. They'll in fact reach out and they basically want, my integral wellness program. What they really mean they want is a policy and a list of equipment to buy that they can then say, well, we have a wellness program here too. And then, right, we're going to realize all the benefits that he's talking about. And, that we all know that that's just not the case. There's so much more to it, that it hasn't been the tip of the spear I had hoped it would be. That being said, it does seem to be the single biggest needle mover. Like, it is, their legislators are talking about it. There was grant funding in the state of California that they didn't even make you apply for. They gave it to every single police department in the state of California for the last 2 years to augment wellness programs. It was ridiculously small amount of money that equated to about $200 per police officer in the state, but it's something, right? So there seems like there might be real opportunity here for that to be the tip of the spear. But somehow, again, we need integral thinking leaders who won't just take it and try to plug and play it and see it as this checkbox. And in most of my meetings with other chiefs, when they ask for them to discuss our program, I try to impose or impress upon them that if you don't change the way you fundamentally treat people as a police administration, none of this will matter at all. You can build a great gym and have anonymous counseling and cold plunges and saunas and relaxation rooms and meditation classes and all the things you're going to see in my program. But the first time that an officer makes a mistake of the mind, not a mistake of the heart, and you decide to hit him with a bag of hammers to drive a point to all of the rest of the officers that this behavior is not tolerated, and there's no forgiveness at all, you've undone any impacts that any of that work would have had. So until you're ready to change the way you see the people who you are charged with serving, it's the same thing with the community. It's just not going to work. And so I hope that that still is the tip of the spear. Maybe the way in is this wellness thing. I also think it could be the 4 quadrants. We keep coming back to it because it's in the very complex world of integral. And I think that's why we all love integral, because it embraces complexity instead of hiding from it. It's a relatively not complex tool that you can kind of coach someone on pretty quickly and just say, hey, just use it your own way to try to analyze the problems you're facing and your decisions, and it will make a big difference in your organization. So those feel like maybe the touch points.
Yeah. Well, as we wrap up, we've got about 10 more minutes, but I'm definitely seeing some consensus around this idea that those are 2 areas where these sort of approaches could make the biggest difference. I'm interested by the idea that, at least on the surface of it, and I know that in your hands, Ryan, it's really being, led from and implemented from a sort of teal space, but in a lot of ways it's kind of a green intervention, and it's one that the larger culture has certainly seen an explosion of in the last 20 or 30 years, just this idea of wellness and mental wellness and all of this. And it's interesting to me to see it taking root. Again, it takes the right person talking about it in the right ways, selling it in the right ways, and the value of it, and demonstrating it in terms of your leadership. But it's interesting to me. I imagine that whether they know it or not, that police departments across the country, around the world, are in some ways struggling with what to do with green. There's certainly elements of green that are positive. There's expectations on the part of the community that are green, that are both positive and negative, at least from the standpoint of police officers. But I'm heartened to see what a sort of green tool or intervention can do in the hands of the right kind of leader. And I wonder if any of you, this was a conversation, Chris, you and I were having about a week ago, about sort of, what happens as police departments start to move out of, orange center of gravity and potentially into green center of gravity. And that seems like kind of a stretch now to think about. But as you think about some of those young folks coming into the department who are bringing those kind of sensibilities along with them, it's not outside of the realm of possibility to imagine that you could start to see that shift in the coming decade. A really strong green leadership. What are your views on that? It's about how police departments can sort of make peace with green and integrate the most healthy aspects of them, which is in itself sort of an integral move.
And I would add the question for Ryan, because I'm curious of the answer is do you see, where do you see the vast majority of police departments, maybe in California, we'll just start there, because I would suspect the center of gravity is still very amber, and that there's very little green. You're bringing in some green sensibilities that people can accept, but I don't know that we're evolutionarily that far along yet.
Yeah, wow, that is such a good question. And I don't know that I'm qualified to make that assessment, kind of as to where we're at more collectively. I do think that, back to our very first question that kicked us off, in the post George Floyd era, there's a lot more green in policing and policing leadership than there was before that. I don't think there's any question about that. I think it may be in Ken's book, A Brief History of Everything, where he talks about what we didn't necessarily anticipate is sort of mean green, that there'd be this possibility that green would vilify everything not green, and entrench itself that way. And I think that fact forced green on police departments that didn't have any interest in moving into green, right? It basically said, you're either green or you're canceled. We're going to defund you and fire your chief, and you're going to embrace these ways of thinking, or you're not going to exist anymore. And for in many cases, sheer desire to continue existing, many police departments immediately acquiesce to that narrative, with some positive outcomes, but some very negative ones. We've talked many times about the fact that I think in a country like the United States, where guns and violence are as prevalent as they are, there will always be the need for a certain level of Auburn or red in policing. At the end of the day, there are situations in which you need someone who is willing to do what most people think to be unthinkable in order to protect the rest of us, similar to with the military. And so, how you bring in the good of green while knowing that that complete opposite of green will continue to be necessary in certain circumstances. And as Gastor talked about earlier, embrace spiral dynamics to get officers to better understand where and when those things are appropriate in their day-to-day dealings is really the big challenge. But I do think we're way more green than we ever were before, and it's presenting both positives and negatives. It's probably why something like a wellness program. I mean, imagine, Chris, you were in this job for a very long time. 10 years ago, if I showed up as a chief in your department and put every single officer in the department through a 2.5-day mindfulness intensive, where they had to go stay on site somewhere with a meditation expert and really sit with the things they're not comfortable with in their lives, I'd have been run out of town on a stick, right? So green opened those doors for these kinds of things in police departments. But then it's also made it increasingly difficult to realize we do still have to do police work. We do still have to go chase bad guys and, insert ourselves between good and evil, which requires a different perspective. And teal obviously is the answer to learning how to integrate, transcend, and include both, right?
And the bottom line is we need all of it, and we need it to be healthy. Yeah, whether it's amber, orange, green, teal, it has to be healthy versions of that. And, and that's constantly in the background of my mind is how do we perpetuate the healthy at whatever level our people are at.
That's where integral, we have to remember, is a two-way street. Like in policing, we always put ourselves on the board and say, we have to become better. We have to become more integral. But this is true of our communities as well. Because there are times where the red shows up in policing and it's healthy. It is healthy. It's what needed to be done, but that's not the picture that's painted largely in the public. And so until we can get communities to kind of come along, and maybe it's not communities at large, but it's the driving forces in the media that will, every time red shows up, it's not healthy, it's not productive, it has no place in society. That's not helping this problem.
Well, I think you guys are potentially slightly more optimistic than I am. I think specifically, post George Floyd, when you get the whole, the thin blue line and all of that feels a lot more purple or magenta to me. And I think there's definitely elements of forces dropping back down into that, to the, us versus them kind of mentality, when specifically when law enforcement is being attacked in media and by society in large. You get a very strong protective urge, and it's quite natural that you drop to a level when the pressure is on where you feel like you're fighting with for the guy next to you rather than some sort of a command or a larger context. But I do think what the framework provides is to help you understand that, like Ryan says, that I could be in an orange, green, yellow, wherever, but of course it's a part of my job to drop into red when needed. And to understand, when and how and what's appropriate is the big thing. But to be able to do that, of course, you have to develop through all of them and understand all of them to be able to then, assert yourself in different ways. So I think I'm seeing, yes, there is increased kind of green seeping in, but I also see a lot of, I feel at least up here, the polarity between being an individual and being a police officer. I mean, the uniform is there for a reason. You are not just Leonard when you show up on the scene. You are a police officer enforcing the law or whatever it is that you're doing. But still, at least up here, I feel some of the younger generations want to maintain their individuality, yet still, when it gets uncomfortable, be a part of the the blue wall, if you will. So there's quite a lot of intricacies in how you kind of address that with the younger generations, the older generations, the different value systems and different levels of ego maturity, and all of that. So I think for me, I haven't found anything better than the AQUAL model, the 4 quadrants, lines, level, stages. It might sound complicated at first, but actually it really, really well applies to law enforcement, as it is a description of our reality. We just haven't had the model to understand what's happening.
I think this concept of the individual and the collective is really important. And it's obviously for another conversation because we're up against the end of our time here. But I found it to be very, very important. And for what it's worth, I have ripped the Band-Aid off on the sort of opposite end of that. I have told people that, at least in California, that you do not get hired to be a police officer as a bad human. That does not happen. This is an exhaustive process of hiring people who genuinely are willing to pay the ultimate price to help people they'll never even know. And so if you're no longer that person 3-4 years down the road, whose fault is that really? It's probably mine and the institution of policing. We have done something to break a good human. And so I tell them the first thing I see there is that I'm hiring you. Today, you are being hired for what you have shown me is you, the person you are, the experiences you bring to the table, the worldview you have. I do not want you to become a San Bruno police officer when you put the uniform on. And, even practical ways of doing this, like, you can see I've got tattoos all over my body, and we removed the tattoo policy, let people show the things that are expressions of who they are. We removed all the hair policies. We have a uniform, but it's not uniform. You can wear, one of 5 different uniforms, whatever you're most comfortable in working every day, all in an effort to get the individual there. My theory being that Josh Leonard, the person, would probably never have done what you just did on the street if you were still being Josh Leonard, but you decided to assume this impersonal role where something you did is now justifiable because of the uniform you put on. No. I want you to stay the person you are. Now, I totally agree with you, Gastore, that there's a problem there when then something bad goes on and you now want to hide behind this veil. And one of my instructors in social identity theory actually covered this so well to me when he said, what we have to stop doing in policing is supporting our nominal in-group, right? We are an in-group that we should be because of our value system, our virtues, and the way we see the world when we're seeing it appropriately. When someone who wears this uniform does something unthinkable, makes a mistake of the heart, we cannot support that person just because they wear that uniform. And we can't allow people to hide behind that. So I completely agree with you there. That is so difficult to do while still keeping sort of a collective identity. And for what it's worth, in our very small department, we've been quite successful with this individuality component and just saying, no, we're gonna stay individuals. You are a part of this team by virtue of our overarching mission and what we see as our calling, but you are you every day. And as soon as you cease being you, or we see you going down that path, we're gonna put the brakes on and bring you into these integrative procedures to take you back to who you are and should be.
So that's very interesting.
That is it's beautiful. I'm going to take this opportunity to wrap us up. I feel like we could probably talk for another hour or two, so we'll just have to save that for part 2 of this conversation. To our audience, I just want to invite you, if any of you are interested in somehow getting involved in integral policing and potentially contributing to an integral policing initiative at the Institute of Applied Metatheory, please reach out to us. I am at appliedmetatheory.com. And we're looking for contributors in all kinds of ways. We've got, Chris is doing some scholarship. I'm sure she would appreciate whatever input and support she might be able to get on some of the research and work she's doing. We're also looking for funders. We're looking for folks who are representing organizations or philanthropies that see the potential for this kind of a model and might be interested in piloting some of larger projects and initiatives such as we've discussed here. And then finally, I just want to conclude by thanking all 3 of our guests. You are all tremendously inspiring to me. This was just a really robust conversation, and I want to thank you for your time and energy here, but perhaps more importantly, for the work you're doing to advance this critical role in society and helping it to evolve. So my thanks to you all for your time and your energy and for your contribution to this work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you, Gester and Ryan.
Thanks to all of you. Josh, thanks very much for facilitating this. I really, obviously, we all believe in it very much, and it requires people outside of our circle to believe as well.
Truly my pleasure, and I will look forward to a follow-up conversation at some point in the future. Okay, thanks everyone.